and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this week's episode of Horns, we're pleased to bring you the first of several sessions, which were recorded at the Clements Center Summer Seminar in History and Statecraft, held at Beaver Creek, Colorado, from July 17th to 22nd. This first of these sessions is by Dr. Kori Schake. Dr. Schake addresses the question of civil-military relations. Simply, this is the relationship between the military and the civilian government that it serves. As scholar Peter Feaver once observed, the problem that civil-military relations tries to address and answer is that you want a military that is strong enough to do anything civilians ask, yet obedient enough to only do those things that civilians ask. Viewed from this sort of perspective, Dr. Schake assures us that U.S. civil-military relations are in good shape. But she also reviews the canon of civil-military relations and how it may fall short in describing American civil-military relations, and in particular some of the challenges that were faced during the Trump administration and which may continue into the present day and beyond in our current atmosphere of polarized partisan politics. This is a terrific presentation by a great expert on an important topic. Let's listen in.
Okay, now my pleasure to introduce our featured keynote speaker for dinner, flown in all the way from Washington, D.C. You're probably picking up a common theme here, but Dr. Kori Schake is also a longtime friend of mine, going back to our days together in the Bush administration. If you Google the Wikipedia entry for Happy Warrior, you'll find Kori. Although I would kind of add a Happy Warrior scholar, right? So, I mean, a woman of many talents and credentials, a Thomas Schelling protege who we heard from Frank this morning was wrong about everything, except for when he supervised Kori, and who taught at Stanford for a number of years, has taught at West Point, will be teaching at Annapolis this fall, had a senior position with the Hoover Institution, has served in multiple presidential administrations at the National Security Council and the State Department and the Pentagon, to kind of the holy trinity of the interagency, and is currently the Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy at the Venerable American Enterprise Institute. But aside from all that, she is also a wonderful human being, a great friend, a great mentor, a great ally to have with you in the trenches or in the foxhole when the slings and arrows of life are coming down on you. So, and she is among her many categories of expertise are civil-military relations, which has been an especially important topic in recent years. And so we're going to hear from Dr. Schake on civil-mil relations.
So a couple of things to start with. I'm going to try and string out as long before I actually have to do my job as Frank did this morning. I clocked him at 10 minutes and 32 seconds. So somebody get a watch on me to see if I can not do my job. So I'm going to tell you something really important right now, which is look around this room, because the people you see here are going to be really important in your life. They are going to be the people who write your promotion letters, the people who get you the chance to publish your book with a posh university press when you don't know how to do it yourself, the people who give you great ideas for how to write books, the people who give you the opportunity to teach where you want the opportunity to teach. These are the people who are going to drag you to inconvenient places where you have to spend 2.5 hours listening to stuff you ought to have demanded a separate car from. Every year when I get the invitation to this, I think, I admire Will Inbiden so much, I would set sail in any fleet he is ever putting to sea. And then I start on my way here, and I think, oh, for Christ's sake, it's the middle of nowhere. They closed the Vail Airport. And then I get here, and I get the chance to learn from you sparklers, and hands down, you guys are so much better than we were at this age. You make me hopeful for the future, and it's going to be so much fun to watch how you spend your time and your talents. So thank you for making this worth doing, coming to the middle of nowhere where I had to be 2.5 hours in a car with Frank. And I need your help on something important, because in a room full of promising historians and political scientists whose work is guided by history, I will offer a bottle of good champagne to anyone who can prove if this story, which I fear is apocryphal, is actually true. It happened sometime between 1966 and 1968. George Brown was the British Foreign Secretary, and he had a reputation as a heavy drinker, and he fancied himself something of a ladies' man. And the story goes that he created an international incident on a state visit to Peru because he, at a reception at the presidential palace, he reportedly asked someone to dance and got the outraged response, "Absolutely not. First of all, because you are drunk. Second of all, because this music is the Peruvian national anthem. And third of all, because I am the Archbishop of Lima." I need evidence that that actually happened, and I will offer a good bottle of champagne to anybody who can find any documentary evidence that that is true. How many minutes am I into the Gavin sweepstakes? Okay.
I tasted champagne with Dr. I can tell you, she's good for an excellent bottle.
Thank you, my friend. Okay, Will's going to make me do my job for 32 minutes. So again, somebody clock me. Because my subject is civil-military relations. And the first thing I will say is that civil-military relations in the United States are strong, stable, but it's a good thing that we are always worried about them because, as James Fallows says in the best article ever written on American foreign policy, it was written in The Atlantic in about 2009, has the boring topic, How America Can Rise Again, but he uses the example of the Jeremiah, right? Jeremiah always fears he is failing God and is therefore beloved of God, as the metaphor for American foreign policy, that only when we think we are failing at things do we actually summon ourselves out of our otherwise more interesting lives and care about what's happening in the world. So I think we should worry about civil-military relations, but maybe not for the reason that most people are worried about civil-military relations. So let's start with the canon. The two origin stories of I should start with the history. Everybody in this room is a better scholar than I am. So let me start with the history. So civil-military relations in the United States benefit enormously from the origin, right? From George Washington. He doesn't demand things of the Continental Congress. He pleads for things from the Continental Congress. He, right from the start, the very first American leader in uniform, is subservient to the Congress and, importantly, takes his uniform off when he becomes a politician. And that casts such an arc of light into civil-military relations. You guys probably know the story of the potential rebellion that Washington, during the Revolution, has said, the war's not going well, Congress isn't providing the weapons, everybody's on short-term contracts. American civilians, these crummy civilians, they're fighting the war to liberate, won't accept continental currency. They'll only accept British currency, right? Like all of that stuff. And so the young hotheads want to rebel and declare Washington king. And Washington, they hand him the letter of their demands, and he kind of fumbles with his glasses and puts them on and says, "I have grown old and nearly blind in my country's service." And everybody backs up 3 steps because you don't want to let the great man down, and he has just told you what you are doing is disgraceful, right? So part of the reason civil-military relations in the United States are so uninteresting in lots of ways is because we have such a magnificent origin story, and that origin story is inspiring for the American military itself. And I will tell you that the main constraint on civil-military relations going sideways in this country is actually the professionalism of the American military itself. Because the American public, this may come as a surprise to some of you who are not historians of the 19th century. We are not newly a country full of crazy people run by reckless politicians. We have always been a country full of crazy people run by reckless politicians. Let's see. Let's think of some examples. George McClellan is running machinations to run for president against his commander-in-chief while he is still in command of the Army of the Potomac. Leonard Wood, while chief of staff of the Army, is campaigning in uniform to be president of the United States in 1920. The revolt of the admirals in the late 1940s. President of the United States having to fire Douglas MacArthur for refusing to subordinate himself to civilian authority. Parenthetically, Harry Truman was the best civil military analyst in this country's history. Two great things he said. First, the Marine Corps is the only organization. Joseph Stalin is the only person who has a better PR campaign than the Marine Corps of the United States. And he had to apologize to the Marine Corps for it. Congress made him apologize, which kind of proves his point, right? Yes, indeed. He didn't think that the country's Navy needed a private army necessarily when we had an army. And whether the Navy's private army needs an Air Force is also a timeless question. The second great thing Truman says is, I didn't fire Douglas MacArthur because he was stupid. If I had to fire every goddamn stupid general in the Army, the entire class would be clear. I fired him because he was insubordinate to the President of the United States. Right? So that's serious civil-military friction, even within the bounds of the American system. In the last 20 years, there has not been serious friction, right? So Heidi Urban, Risa Brooks, and Jim Golby wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs a year ago in which they were having fainting spells about friction between civilian leadership and the military in the United States. And I don't know anybody in the Pentagon who didn't think the abandonment of Afghanistan on the terms we abandoned Afghanistan last August was going to be anything other than a humiliation and a catastrophe. Everybody shut up and did it because the president decided that's what needed doing. That's the actual test of civil-military relations. Can the president make a choice that the military doesn't want to have happen, and they salute and do it? And the second great test of civil-military relations is, can the president fire a senior military officer and the other senior military officers enforce it and support it? Let's see, President Obama fired McKiernan, McChrystal, all the Irishmen got in trouble. But the McChrystal example is an especially interesting one, right? Because McKiernan got fired over strategy for the war. McChrystal got fired not even because of something he did, but because of something that the colonels in his staff had recklessly said to a reporter. And yet, he created a command climate in which those senior officers thought that was appropriate behavior. And so the president fired him. I don't know a senior officer who thought the president was inappropriate to have fired him, right? Because first of all, everybody serves at the leisure and preference of the president of the United States, and everybody knows it. But second of all, that is a command climate problem when people think they can trash talk the vice president of the United States. And, I see the point that General McChrystal had other things on his mind, but that doesn't excuse it. And one of the great things about military culture in the United States is the belief that anytime you walk by somebody who isn't meeting standard, you have just set a new standard. Like, that's the culture of the institution, and you couldn't let McChrystal's mistake set a new standard. So I don't think civil-military relations are particularly fraught in the United States. But let's talk about the canon of civil-military relations. So it starts with Sam Huntington in the 1950s. So Sam Huntington has a couple of advantages. He has the first mover advantage, just like the realists do in IR theory. And he also he sets the terms of the debate, right? Just like the realists calling themselves realists because everybody else isn't realistic. Which is nonsense. But Huntington in Soldier and the State argues that the right structure for civil-military relations is complete separation until you get to the highest political level. That's what lets the military practice and prioritize the profession. And that's what keeps politicians from meddling in the profession. The American military loves this model, right? Because you get to be left alone, and all these nonsense used car salesman, political appointee, assistant secretary of the Air Force don't get to talk nonsense to you all day long when you are trying to train fighter pilots. And Huntington sort of is viewed as the father of this. I hope one day we will treat Soldier and the State with the same derision that we treat Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, because it's the same kind of really interesting, really thought-provoking, bad solution to a problem. So the second in the canon of civil-military relations is Morris Janowitz. And he argues, no, and he's sort of Vietnam era, right? Argues, no, you can't leave the military to their own devices. They could be a danger to civilian control. Therefore, we need to be enmeshed in it all the way along to keep the military from overthrowing the country. 180 or so years of American history in which the American military was never a threat to civilian governance in this country was blithely passed by Morris Janowitz. But his argument errs on the other side of the, right? Like, we're doing the Goldilocks thing, too hot, too cold. Janowitz is too cold. And when people look back at Lyndon Johnson picking bombing targets during the Vietnam War, they blame Morris Janowitz wrongly, because he's arguing it ought to happen much lower levels so that you understand the political and the military interface. But Janowitz gets wrongly tarred with the brush of the mistakes of the politicians in the Vietnam War. We have forthcoming the Goldilocks solution from the friend of many people in this room, Sir Lawrence Friedman, who has a book coming out on the politics of command in the fall. And it's a theme he started with in a history of strategy, right? Which is that coming out of the Napoleonic Wars, the great writers about military strategy wanted to push the politicians out of the frame. They wanted the politicians to give us a mission, and then the military gets to determine the resources required and get on with it as best they see fit. And that, to some extent, gets exemplified in the Prussian general staff, right? It's not true that German political leaders don't bear responsibility for the Schlieffen Plan, right? They did agree to this, and they didn't have to agree to this. But the exquisite nature of a win in the West and pivot to the East with the same army, and it's all going to work out perfectly, that's bad strategy. And the sense of, but we're exquisite professionals and the politicians shouldn't mess in what we do, is the problem with the Schlieffen Plan, right? The belief that you can have military planning that isn't tawdry and political. Because my experience doing military strategy in government, in the Pentagon and in the White House, is that there are no good military plans that aren't inherently political. Because unless the military leadership understands what the president is actually trying to do and how much the president is willing to push into the effort, you're going to get bad military advice and you're going to get bad military planning. This notion that has become popularized that there's best military advice independent of political guidance, that's just nonsense, right? That's Schlieffen trying to say, it's not my fault if this fails. Good military planning, as Lori Friedman argues, is inherently political all the way down the line. And the way that you do it right is to have enough of the Janowitzian interface that the military understand, oh, that's what he wants to do, and has a sense for how thick the ice the president's standing on in the doing of it. Because no American president has ever given 100% of national effort to the war. Lincoln didn't do it. Roosevelt didn't do it. The Continental Congress didn't do it, right? They were all making trade-offs of how do we keep the economy functioning? How do I prevent draft riots in New York City? All of those things. Those are properly and appropriately choices only the person who Americans elect can make, right? And unless the military understands all of those things, and let me just give you an example. Let's take the war plan for Iraq in 2003, right? The president was actually pretty clear about his political objectives, which presidents very rarely are, right? Because what politicians like to do, want to do, get paid to do is keep their options open for as long as they can keep their options open, right? President Clinton is reported to have said in exasperation at the start of the Kosovo War, Madeline, why did you get me into this? I wanted to do Social Security reform. Because he understood you have limited political capital, and that isn't what he wanted to spend it on. He wanted to spend it on something else. President Bush was actually pretty clear, right? WMD and regime change. The Pentagon produced a war plan that the first iteration had a 3-brigade rolling start. How do you accomplish either of those two political objectives with 3 brigades on the run into the country? The answer is you don't, right? The person responsible for doing this, the only person whose job, there are 2 people whose job it is to understand the president's political objectives and make sure that the military planning accomplishes them. Those 2 people are the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of Defense. And principally it falls to the Secretary of Defense because they're a politician, right? They're a member of the cabinet. They are the president's guy in a 2 million person bureaucracy with an $800 billion a year budget. So what Secretary Rumsfeld did was, instead of caring about the president's political objectives, caring more about showing that there's a new way of war, right? That I did actually hear him say to the president, these generals, they're dinosaurs. They think it takes 500,000 troops to accomplish anything. What we have just shown in Afghanistan is there's a whole new way of war, and you are going to be the architect of it, Mr. President. And President Bush turned like a sunflower towards the sunshine, right? So the Chief of Staff of the Army, Rick Shinseki, realizes we are on a path to a disaster, sends reinforcements to CENTCOM. We need a better plan than this. But by that time, the Secretary of Defense is looking through somebody who's in military service here, say what the acronym TIPFID stands for.
Time Phase Force Deployment System.
Thank you. The Secretary of Defense, the only person who can say how the president's political objectives translate into the resources, timing, and strategy of our use of military force, is busy pulling port handlers off the TIPFID in order to show that we could do this with a whole bunch of lists, which creates chaos and confusion in the process, right? So if you wonder how disasters happen, this is how disasters happen, right? Because as Clausewitz himself says, in warfare, everything is simple, but the simple is extraordinarily difficult. It is simple to say the Secretary of Defense needs to take the president's political objectives and translate them into military objectives. It's very hard if you are, for example, the J7 war plans guy, when you can't get anybody between you and the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of Defense is unavailable to you to explain, what are we trying to do? Because I can give you a plan for anything, but what are we trying to do? So the military very often resents their political leadership. I am here to tell you that is a fundamentally healthy part of civil-military relations in these United States. The best talk on civil-military relations I ever heard was a toss-off 30-second comment from Elliot Cohen, who said during the election of the year 2000, it's very important that George Bush gets elected president so that the military can learn to hate Republicans again, right? Because political leaders do not necessarily, in fact, almost never, have the military's best interests at mind. And very often they don't understand the culture or, the political impetus is often, we need to do something, right? And the military's like, whoa, that is an avenue to disaster. And this is where Janowitz comes in, because in Huntington's universe, you can't solve that problem. You just keep getting bad outcomes. In Janowitz's universe, you can actually get to know your civilian or military counterparts and have a conversation about, tell me what you're trying to do. Let's talk about ways you could do it. And you get to choose the way you do it. Because that's how civil-military relations actually work when they work well. They get very brittle if you don't have that kind of Janowitzian interaction. And Laurie Friedman makes a fabulous case. You can see him start to tease it out in History of Strategy, where he says these Napoleonic guys are wrong, right? Like, they don't get it. And in his forthcoming book, so this is the fun part. I get to tell you what's in a book that's already coming out. And if you want to talk about Will's fabulous book, I had the pleasure of reading that one too. So I'll be glad to tell you the part so you can pretend you read all 87,000 words of it. What Laurie argues in Command is he looks at case studies from the Korean War forward and looks at where military planning is attempted in isolation of the political constraints, and almost invariably it produces bad outcomes, right? But where you actually struggle, have the unpleasant conversations that take you to genuine understanding, the political leadership has the right to choose any crazy thing they want, right? That's the privilege of getting elected in the United States. The military has to figure out how to do it, making clear what the risks are, making clear what the consequences of failure are, making clear what the resources it would take. But they don't get to choose what anybody does. The good news is the American military really gets this. They understand it. They teach it. They train to it. When Jim Mattis and I were writing Warriors and Citizens, we did a big survey of American public attitudes about the military. And there were several things about it that were interesting in the data that I think help explain the fraught sense of civil-military relations at this moment. So the first thing that was interesting in the data was the attitudes of people under 25 about the economy and about the security approximate the attitudes of people who lived through the Great Depression and World War II. And it shocked us, but when we pause to think about it, you can sort of see they came on the job market after the 2008 financial crisis. So of course the economy feels incredibly unstable to them in a way that those of us who grew up in an earlier time period don't have. But second of all, the country's been at war they've been seeing pictures in the newspapers of war their entire lives. The second thing that was really interesting and anomalous in the data is that there's a sort of time lag, and people think the leadership of the military is more conservative than the rest of society. That's not actually true. That was true in the late 1990s, and that's not true anymore. What you see is a lag of about 6 years in opposition to whoever's in office, because Eliot was right? They learned to dislike the people in office because of the difficulty of making this work. The most important thing, though, were the reasons that the American public loves our military so much. It's actually not because they win wars, because name the last war the United States won. The public, though, has great, and they're woefully ignorant. They can't come within a factor of 6 of the size of the United States Army, but they've got great judgment, right? They understand that it's actually the fault of the political leaders if you lose a war, because they understand that the president's the one responsible for the strategy and the resourcing, and that the military is trying to execute the president's plan. They also understand that the wars the United States has fought since 1945 are wars about the shape of the international order. And it's a terrible thing to say that choosing fights even if you don't win them, or choosing fights where you buy time for circumstances to change, is worth people's lives. But that is actually what the American public thinks. The third thing, the American public makes no distinction between female casualties and male casualties in combat. And they are not nearly as sensitive to casualties as the military would like to think they are. The public views casualties in combat very much like they view firefighters dying in a fire. Like, they chose this is the risks they run for all of us, and we show our appreciation in all sorts of ways for that. And so the public's not nearly as casualty sensitive as the military and as political leadership believes they are. And the last thing, the reason the American public loves their military so much is the commitment to something bigger than yourself, right? They don't see that in many other parts of American society, and they love that about the American military. And the second thing they love about the American military is it's a conveyor belt into the middle class. It's a conveyor belt to citizenship. It's a conveyor belt to a college education in a time in which many other avenues of social and economic mobility have silted up. The public understands and loves that about the American military. So it's weird that actually the crisp professionalism that the military values most prominently about itself is actually not what the public values most about it, but it creates the ability for failures and misjudgments and, bad programming decisions in the Pentagon and budget nonsense. The public doesn't think the military tells the truth about the budget. They think they're a shameless bureaucrat, all those things, but they still love them. And here's where we get to the punchline, which is the American public would very much like to pull the American military into the partisan politics of our time. The American military is begging to be left out of it for the most part. And the higher rank you are, the more you are desperately begging to be left out of this. But the public begins to view the American military the way they view the Supreme Court. If you agree with my policies, I think you're awesome. If you don't, you're shamelessly political. And you can see this with General Milley, volunteering his view on critical race theory in a congressional hearing when nobody asked him, and then getting buffeted by the winds of it. The thing is, it doesn't actually assist the advancement of policies or candidates for the military, even retired military, to endorse them. What it does is it decreases the public's respect for the military. So it's bad for the institution, even if people think it's valuable in the moment. I would love to talk about Lafayette Square, about January 6th, about anything under the sun, but I have hit my 32 minutes, so I have to stop.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.